Back in 2023, I posted a video on social media where I talked about why I became an activist and why I became involved with Extinction Rebellion. If you haven't checked out that video, I would highly recommend checking that out first. But following up from that, I was thinking about the question, what radicalized me? At the heart of it, I began to think about values. I began to think about what values are important to me and important to a healthy society. So I started to think about compassion, care, love, empathy, and kindness. I'd like to think that we would all agree that these are really important values to hold. So some great examples of these values in action might be work or volunteering that involves feeding houseless people, or any kind of social justice, or any kind of other acting for other people, for other animals, or for the environment as a whole. From there, I began to ask questions like, well, why do these issues exist in the first place? What's the root cause of these issues? Is there a way of solving these issues and removing the cause and having a much bigger impact that way? So kind of treating it like you are preventing the issue rather than having to apply a cure. And I also wondered, is there a central issue at the heart of all of these big worldly problems? Or maybe, more to the point, is there a particular really pressing issue at the heart of all of this? And is it maybe the climate crisis? I remember learning about the climate crisis when I was in primary school. And thinking like, hey, we're animals too. We're part of the environment. The environment sustains us. We can't live without it. So shouldn't that be one of the most important things that we care for and act upon in life? Maybe I didn't reflect on it that deeply and that hard straight away, but I just remember that feeling really important. So my response to having all these questions was then to have to do some research, to learn. So I started to look to science, to history, and to experts in these kinds of fields. But probably the biggest turning point for me in radicalization, or taking further action, was when I first went to a Heading for Extinction talk. Now this is something that Extinction Rebellion rolled out, I think in 2019, and I believe that one of the core writers of this talk, this Heading for Extinction talk, was Jane Morton, who is an amazing human being. After having been to this talk and being overwhelmed with how much of an emergency, how much of a crisis the planet is in, but also seeing that there's a community out there of people that want to make a difference, and that there's some pretty radical ways of making change, I was really inspired, and I really wanted to get further involved. Some other amazing resources that I would highly recommend people check out, from short form all the way to long form. Perhaps if you're an Instagram user, you might like to check out Earthly Education or Earthly Guy. These are two linked accounts that are constantly posting educational memes on climate and the whole system, and full of absolute gems. Also on Instagram are pages from some really important authors, such as Jason Hickel or George Monbiot. Check out their pages if you're on Instagram. If you want something a little bit longer form, then you might want to check out Our Changing Climate or Andrewism on YouTube. Also some great channels. But most importantly for me has been a whole variety of books. Books can just get into so much more detail, and you can see all of the well-referenced resources, and you can see that these people are experts in their fields. Probably two of the most impactful books for me, I mentioned these in the last video, were Dr. Karl's little book of climate change science and Less is More by Jason Hickel. These are big turning points in terms of learning how bad things are in terms of our climate on this planet, but also how they've gotten to be that way because of the system that we live under and how we've exploited people from other countries so that we can have a comfortable life. I don't believe that it should be this way, and I don't believe that it has to be this way. A book that is often referenced within activist circles is This is an Uprising. This is a really good example of how activism works, how it has worked in the past, the history of it making great social change for the better. This is an Uprising is a strong argument for why we should do activism. Slick is a great book that explains and describes state capture. It shows how the fossil fuel industry has an amazing stronghold over government and the political system. As a South Australian, this is a very relevant book. It's written by a local journalist. It's written in terms of the Australian fossil fuel industry. So it's very, very relevant. I found a lot of interest and enjoyment reading Voyages, which is another South Australian author, Lauren, has done an amazing job on connecting all of these issues and telling a story that we can all relate to. So if you want something on a much more local level, please check out Voyages. Any of these amazing books are worth checking out, and any more books by the same authors are also really important. Any of the works here by Jason Hickel, whether it's Less is More or his other book The Divide, whether it's George Monbiot, whether it's Naomi Klein, they're all brilliant authors. George Monbiot's book here is all about our food systems and how insanely at risk they are. There are so many connecting points here in terms of the climate crisis. So thinking about how these values that are important to me are reflected in this work, I made a speech at the steps of Parliament House for a protest about protest laws. Some new harsh protest laws were brought in South Australia, and I was one of a collection of people that's made some speeches at a new protest. In my speech, I argued that protest is an act of compassion. To be optimistic and to make a positive difference, to be able to impact and change politics, is an act of compassion and care. And regardless of what your values might be, once you learn from all of this research, the science and history, once you come to understand how the systems that govern our lives work, you will choose to act differently in your own life. You will likely seek some sort of community or other people that have similar understandings of the world. Through all my research and involvement within this community, I've learned about how the capitalist system, in particular infinite growth economics, has brought us these issues of climate change, war, poverty, famine, and that radical change from capitalism, the radical change that we need to move away from this infinite growth system, won't come from within the system and its politics, because it's built in such a way that it perpetuates. If we want a positive, equitable future for all people, all living things, and the planet, we need to become radical to get there. If we want the kind of future that is described in solar punk stories, and if you don't know what solar punk is, check it out, it's awesome. If we want that kind of future, the working class needs to organize. We need to rise up against capitalist class. And we need to embrace all kinds of tactics to get there. I've had experiences with Extinction Rebellion, Rising Tide, Blockade Australia, and more. They all do things a little bit differently, and I think they're all extremely important ways of acting. We need to learn from the concepts and successes of the past, of previous activism, as we can read in books like This is an Uprising. We also need to learn from all the different alternatives to capitalism that exist. Whether it's socialism, communism, or some form of anarchism, we should learn from what has worked, what hasn't, and why. If we want to make significant changes, and if we want to survive the climate crisis and all the social crises that are getting worse and worse every day, if we want a sustainable, compassion-based society where everyone has a place to thrive, then we need to learn and build community together. In South Australia, a good place to start is to attend SAGE. SAGE stands for South Australian Grassroots Ecosystem. Another good place to start is just to go to protests. Get involved in community. Read, listen, engage. Learn about the systems of our world and do what you can to make a positive change. This is kind of my journey of radicalization. I've signed lots of petitions. I've volunteered doing environmentalist work, but it didn't feel like it was going anywhere. I've donated money to charities, but I began to understand that this wasn't going to be enough. Modern lives are busy and difficult. The structures most of us live under have apathy, consumerism, and other priorities purposely built into them. We're bogged down paying rent, paying for your mortgage, all of that kind of stuff, but this helps the capitalist class, the powerful, so that we don't speak up, because they know protest works. Otherwise, why would we see quick knee-jerk actions to protest? And here in South Australia, we had new laws brought in record time the next day to shut down protests in order to scare the activists away, because the people in power are worried. But even for an introvert like me, I found great solace in taking part in activism and in activist communities. I don't know about you, but I'm typically a very stern rule abider. I never got in trouble in school. I've never been into alcohol or drugs. I even get unreasonably upset if rules aren't strictly followed in a board game, for example. I'm sure I have friends out there that can attest to that. I'm very conflict averse and generally not outspoken, but I trust in the methods of science. I trust in the research and the history that I've read in all of these amazing books, all of this literature, all of the Instagram and YouTube pages I mentioned. I accept the history, I accept the science, and that we're in an extremely dire situation, and the solutions to these situations, they're going to require sacrifice, bravery, and most importantly, significant changes away from a capitalist system. We will guarantee the worst trajectory if we give up fighting for a livable future. I think this meme with this big wave is a great example of what we're facing. This is taken from the Earthly Education Instagram page that I mentioned. In case you haven't noticed, this is what we're facing. And the primary issue is not overpopulation or the amount you recycle. The main problems are infinite growth, capitalism, and the billionaires and fossil fuel companies and executives that prop up this system. Our nemesis as the human race are these systems and the ways they're sustained through the likes of the Atlas Network and misinformation and disinformation spread throughout colluding mainstream media. The mainstream media platforms that spread this misinformation and disinformation, they also benefit because most of them are also run by wealthy members of the capitalist class. People like Rupert Murdoch are a member of the capitalist class who benefit from the system despite it destroying our planet, putting people in poverty, etc., etc. If you're on board with any of this information, you're interested, please start checking out different resources, getting involved in community. This is going to require all of us to make a change. It's kind of like that scene in A Bug's Life, if any of you out there have seen that, where he uses there's like a cricket or something, and he uses a whole bunch of grains, and he kind of takes one grain and he throws it at the other crickets, and he goes like, does that hurt? No. But then he's got a whole giant jar of it, and it completely covers the cricket, and he's completely overwhelmed. It's a simple, crude example, but that's exactly what we need. As it happens, we have an election imminent in Australia. I always have vote Greens and Independent, and that's because I vote based on the policies of the political parties and for the history of what the politicians within those parties have voted for. There's a great website called theyvoteforyou.org where you can actually look at what bills different politicians have or haven't voted for, whether they voted yes or no, and you can have a look. See if they're actually voting for the best interests of everyday Australians or everyday people. In my experience, looking at the policies of political parties and the history of what bills they've voted for, the best options I can see and have always seen have been the Greens and Teal independents. I think it's really important to vote, and to vote wisely. Think carefully about why you're voting. Is it because you've got an idea formed about a party that's been influenced by the media or advertising? Or is it because you're voting specifically for policies that you know will help everyday people? These things will make a big difference. I'd love to see the Greens in power in Australia. At this election, I'd love to see a minority Labor government with Greens having an impact. But even as we make very purposeful votes, we can't expect change from within the system, as it's well designed to perpetuate the interests of the capitalist class, no matter what. And this is a global issue where we need change across the world. Again, get involved in activist spaces, get involved in activist community. People in poverty barely contribute to any emissions to this planet, while the billionaires contribute exorbitant amounts. The people in poverty continue to suffer and experience worse lives, but it's the billionaires, the US military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel companies and executives. They're the ones that are benefiting from capitalism. They're the ones that are causing all of the problems. Climate change, poverty, etc. Our global economic system is deliberately structured in a way that funnels the wealth, power and resources into the hands of these people, into the hands of a small group of people who are not acting in the best interests of the rest of us. They have not got the values of compassion and care and kindness in mind. When I'm involved in activism, I'm clearly not acting on a whim. A lot of my thoughts and research is based on compassion and compassionate action. This is why I've got involved in activism. I'd much rather be spending my time doing other things. With family, making music, tending to my garden, playing video games. I also work 2 jobs and have a very busy life, but I find time for activism and activist communities because all of this is simply too important. If your home is ever flooded or burnt down or blown over because of an extreme weather event, you might come to understand why we engage in activism, because we're trying to make a difference. Because as it stands, these situations are becoming more and more likely every day. As we experience climate breakdown, as the world burns, as the rich get richer, I like to think, what's the point of stars and galaxies, of hills and forests, without someone to perceive them? Do we really want to throw away the wonderful life that we have simply because we didn't stand up? We didn't try and make a change. We got too busy trying to make some money, trying to get by. And before we knew it, everything fell apart. The overwhelming nature of this reality and of the content of all of these books and this research is undoubtedly too much for many people to bear. Especially if you're experiencing a really stressful life. If you're drained from the perceived necessities of the daily grind under capitalist society, as we're separated from our families and our communities, as we work for ourselves under stressful situations, paying our rent, paying our mortgages, and as we're sold ideas about owning everything for ourselves rather than sharing resources, and that happiness comes from financial wealth because of all the things that brings, rather than the fact that we really just need more leisure time and to work for and with community rather than for CEOs. Despair is a tool of the powerful. They want us either hopeless or deluded that things will get better, so that business as usual, their ever-growing profits, will continue. I certainly would rather not spend so much time thinking about these issues and posting about them on social media and engaging in activism. But it's entirely unconscionable not to, once you have an understanding of how dire the climate and biodiversity crises are, of how socially unjust the world is and the systems of the world, namely capitalism and neoliberalism. I am not blindly positive that humans will overcome these challenges, and that the world will magically become a better place with our current political system or through technology or anything like that. I know for a fact through the information in all of these books and resources that it won't magically happen. I am an optimistic and happy person, however. But that's only possible thanks to the incredible luck and privilege I've experienced in my life. In my life as a middle-class white person living in a wealthy nation. A position I can only be in thanks to the exploitation of our planet and of the people of the global south. Whether it's plastic pollution, animal agriculture, recycling rates, fossil fuels, poverty, animal cruelty, colonialism. The root cause is always the greed which is inherent in the infinite growth capitalist system. The root cause is always the greed inherent in the capitalist system. The root cause is always the greed inherent in the infinite growth capitalist system. A greed which I like to think is not an inherent part of human nature. To remain positive, I think we have to believe that most people are inherently good to have hope for a better system. There has always been and always will be conflict and abuses of power. This is part of being human. But there are tens of thousands of years of human history where community has thrived, where people have been happy, and I believe that there is a place for that in a progressive future for humanity. All of this, that's what's radicalized me. I'm not particularly confident in talking about all of this in person, because it takes me a while to dwell on it, to become articulate, and I don't retain the facts and figures well. That's why if you're interested in any of this, if you want to discover more, you really ought to check out these Instagram pages, check out these books, check out these YouTube channels. I'll link them in the description. They're produced by the experts, after all. If we think that life is the most valuable thing in the universe, and it's such a rare and likely thing in our cosmos, then shouldn't we do our utmost to protect it and preserve it? We are currently in the midst of the sixth mass extinction event on this planet. So we really can't be doing a good job at this point in protecting life. The people I've met in activist communities, whether it be Extinction Rebellion, Rising Tide, Blockade Australia, or SAGE, these people have been some of the kindest, most compassionate and caring people I've ever met. Those values I mentioned at the beginning are wholeheartedly embodied by these people. The people in activist communities have really affirmed for me the idea that this work is based on these fundamental values. The fundamental values of society that I'm sure we would all like to strive for. Terrible atrocities are happening right now the world over. Resisting the capitalist system is to resist those atrocities. And that resistance comes in the forms of activism, protest, and radicalization. I think these are really important topics, and as I've said, I'm no expert. I've just engaged in some really important content. I'm hoping to make a few more videos like this where I actually speak to other people and hear their ideas. And I've already made one with my friend Ormio. So if you enjoyed this, watch out for my next video talking about the same ideas, what radicalized me, but with Ormeo and hopefully with other people in the future. If you've watched this and enjoyed it, and you'd like to do something similar with me, please get in touch. I really enjoyed making the video with Ormeo. I've enjoyed sharing these ideas. Check out my previous video on this stuff if you haven't. And if you've made it all the way to this part of the video, thank you so much for listening and checking it out. Get involved in community. Show your values of compassion and kindness. And I'll see you around.